Well, I'd like to welcome everybody to this panel event. First of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Margie Buchanan-Smith. I'm a trustee of the Rift Valley Institute, also policy researcher and evaluator myself. The event is run by the XCEPT research program. And for those of you who don't know it, XCEPT stands for the Cross-Border Conflict Evidence Policy and Trends. The event's being held to discuss how conflict-related shocks can have major unanticipated consequences for regions or countries that are heavily reliant on imports of essential goods. So what we're going to discuss today is the differing impacts on the African Red Sea region and on Syria of the disruption of trade in global commodities, in particular grain, due to external shocks. So just a couple of housekeeping points before we sort of get into the full event. First of all, just to let everybody know that this event is being recorded and it will be available on the XCEPT website afterwards. But also to let you know that after we've had the presentations, we're going to be requesting that you post your questions in the question and answer channel, and then I will pull them out for the speakers to respond to when we get to that part of the event. So moving to the next slide, as I mentioned, the XCEPT program, it looks at the transnational dimensions of conflict, what drives violent and also peaceful behavior, but also how policy responses should adapt. So as the map you can see on your screen shows, the XCEPT research focuses on protracted conflicts across Africa, the Middle East, and into parts of Asia. It's led by the Comonix International and also the Asia Foundation, but working with King's College in London, Chatham House, the Malcolm H. Carnegie Middle East Centre, the Rift Valley Institute, and Conciliation Resources. The programme also includes the XCEPT Research Fund, which is intended to broaden the pool of research and to respond to emerging issues. And I'd particularly like to acknowledge some of the Rift Valley Institute researchers from South Sudan who are on this webinar from the local research network under XCEPT, who've been conducting research on the grain trade and changing tastes in South Sudan. So we're hoping that you may be able to post some questions from your experience and the work that you're doing in South Sudan when we get to the Q&A chat function later. So in terms of our agenda today, we are going to hear from 3 people, and let me first of all introduce each of them. So Dr. Stephen Serrels is a research fellow at the Leibniz Zentrum Moderner Orient and Consulting, the Leibniz Zentrum Moderner Orient Institute, and is a consulting researcher with the Rift Valley Institute. He's the author of Starvation and the State, Famine, Slavery and Power in Sudan, 1883 to 1956, and also The Impoverishment of the African Red Sea. So some of you may be familiar with those publications. Dr. Haid Haid is a Syrian columnist and a consulting associate fellow of the Chatham House Middle East and North Africa programme. Previously, Dr. Haid was a research fellow at the International Centre for the Study of Radicalisation at King's College in London, and also worked as a programme manager on Syria and Iraq at the Heinrich Böll Stiftung Middle East office in Beirut. Thirdly, let me introduce Iris Kreber, who will be our discussant today, who's the head of food security, land and agriculture, and the senior advisor at the UK Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, FCDO. Iris also represents the UK on the steering committee of the GAFSP, which is a global multilateral initiative that may be familiar to some of you, supporting resilience, food security, and agricultural transformation towards the SDG Zero Hunger goal. Iris has also worked for Welthungerhilfe, the German INGO, and has worked in the private sector. So what we're going to start off with today is Stephen's going to provide a historical perspective of the trends that have resulted in the African Red Sea region becoming highly import dependent and having transitioned from more local food production, and also highlighting the costs of that transition based on his recent research publication, Purchasing Insecurity, the African Red Sea region and the global food trade. So, Stephen, over to you.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm going to try to move relatively quickly because I'm going to try to summarize a paper in about 8 minutes. But my topic has really kind of 3 key points. You could move to the next slide. So the 3 topics are that the Horn of Africa is currently vulnerable to food systems, to food availability shocks, that this is represents a historic shift away from local food production towards a reliance on food imports, and finally that that this shift is in part the result of a legacy of failed investments, and this has made a kind of left a kind of vulnerability resulting from food dependence. So to move forward to the next slide, the current food system, the way that we can best think about it is that it's a market-based system that is highly dependent on food imports. This changes from country to country and year to year, depending on environmental conditions and political turmoil. But in some countries like Djibouti, no more than 10% of food is grown locally. In others, it can range from 70 to 95% per year. But anyway, the fact of any structural dependence on vulnerability on food imports has made it structurally vulnerable to have made the food system structurally vulnerable to external hazards. These hazards can be food price spikes, as this happened in recent memory in 2008, but also food availability declines, which is currently what is happening now. And that is what links the current food crisis that has been going on in the region since last year to the war in Ukraine. This is fundamentally a global food availability spike decline impacting local conditions there. So how did we get to this system? So traditionally, the food system of the region was not dependent on food imports. Generally, local diets were comprised of foods harvested, hunted, raised, or foraged locally. There was some amount of foreign food that was eaten either through that food being imported and then locally raised, or to a limited extent, elites eating high-value, low-bulk foods such as spices. The other exception to eating locally was on the coast, that there was some international trade, but was really bound just to the coast because shipping from the coast inland was very cost prohibitive. This entire system of local production and distribution of food across the inland parts of the region was heavily dependent on cattle. And cattle for plowing the fields is depicted in this image, but also cattle in terms of how the lending of cattle was related to the distribution of food. So if we can switch to the next slide, this whole system collapsed at the end of the 19th century very suddenly. This was an environmental disaster. In 1887, rinderpest, a disease that had previously been unknown to the region, was imported likely through the Eritrean port of Massawa and then quickly spread. And as it spread over the region, agricultural collapse, pastoralism collapsed. The interdependence between agriculturalists and pastoralists that allowed food to circulate and to be cultivated and circulated ended. And the result was a widespread famine that lasted between 1888 and 1891, during which in some regions, 2/3 of the population died. And then rinderpest became endemic to the region, and as a result, you could not just rebuild what had been. And this created an opening for the development of what will be the modern food system, an opening for the creation of new states in the region, for carving the region up in terms of colonies, and establishing new political orders. If we can move to the next slide. And this new political order had to deal with the disaster of not just the famine that had happened, but also how can you rebuild where there is no resources for rebuilding, where the oxen are not there. And what they did was they turned to basically universally turned to some kind of levels of public-private partnership in which the government often funded the development of new kinds of infrastructure, railroads, steamships in the open sea, steamships on rivers, eventually roads with trucks. And then the private sector developed new credit systems and marketing techniques that allowed for the movement of the marketing of grain in new ways. And this had kind of two effects. One is it allowed for surplus that was grown locally to find in specific regions where it was possible to find markets locally. But the other one is that it opened the doors to imports of food primarily from India. Please move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the political leaders that created the system, they did not want dependence on food imports. They recognized this as a destabilizing factor almost immediately. And basically from the beginning of the 20th century on, there was repeated efforts to invest in expanding food production in ways that would transform the region overall into a net food exporter. Some examples of this were ones under the British during the First World War, under Italian fascists during the Second World War, large-scale mechanized agricultural programs of the post-Second World War period, the breadbasket plan for Sudan in the 1970s, 1980s, and fundamentally none of these succeeded. I can speak more specifically about this in the Q&A if you'd like, but the end effect of all of this is pretty bad for the overall food system. If we can move to the next slide, what you have is further destabilization of the rural countryside in place of the facilitating a rebound from the complete collapse of agriculture at the end of the 19th century. What you have happen over the course of the 20th century is the setting in of structural poverty. People cannot maintain themselves in the rural countryside, and they are then pushed off the land and migrate to cities. Cities themselves become the sites for a new kind of cosmopolitanism that allows for the development of new kinds of tastes. Often these tastes are for things that are not locally available, such as sugar, and then they have to be imported. And the end effect of all of this is something that is fundamentally destabilizing. The picture that you can see here is from protests in 2018 in Sudan. If we can switch to the next slide, please. Oh, sorry, somehow the next slide is not there. They're fundamentally destabilizing, not just for the overall food system, but actually it has political consequences. The local economies cannot support the level of food imports that is necessary through the course of every year in every possible form of economic and environmental variability that there is. And so as a result, you have things like in 2008, 2018, currently large-scale destabilizing political protests that are direct responses to the kind of food price inflation that is caused by the vulnerability of dependence on food imports. Thank you. And now I'm going to hand it over to Haid to give the second part of the talk, which is on the supply chain of wheat to Syria from Russia and Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and thanks especially for keeping so well to time. So let me just say, yeah, Haid is going to describe how Syria has also switched from self-sufficiency to dependence on imports more recently and much more rapidly, and is going to, in particular, to tell us about what he calls the conflict supply chain of wheat from Russia and Ukraine to Syria. So, Dr. Haid, over to you.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My remarks will focus on three main topics. The first one is related to how Syria has transformed from self-sufficiency to food insecurity as a result of the ongoing conflict. The second one will highlight the reasons behind Syria becoming a primary destination for stolen wheat from Ukraine. And finally, I will point out that Syrian wheat shortages have continued despite these shipments. Going now to the first point, unlike in Ukraine, where the conflict risks wasting unexported grains, the war in Syria has made the country dependent on imported wheat. Prior to 2011, Syria produced around 3.5 million tons of wheat per year, which satisfied domestic consumption needs. However, large-scale damage to the infrastructure, deepening economic crisis, territorial divisions, displacement, and bad weather conditions have nearly halved the country's wheat production. As a result, the Syrian government has become heavily reliant on wheat imports from Russia, which currently range between 1.2 and 1.5 million tons a year. Moscow's occupation of parts of Ukraine has significantly increased the volume of grains shipped from those annexed regions to regime-held territories. According to my research, the occupied Crimea alone exported over 1 million tons of wheat to Syria between 2019 and 2022. Moving to the second point, Syria's lack of concern about secondary sanctions and willingness to overpay Moscow has made it a primary destination for the stolen wheat. The sanctions imposed on both countries have encouraged close cooperation with one another due to the limited options available elsewhere. It's important to clarify that the sanctions imposed on Russia have managed to prevent many countries from buying the stolen wheat due to a fear of secondary sanctions. But the sanctions already imposed on both Syria and Russia have at the same time limited their trading partners and made them less concerned about the consequences of their cooperation. Besides, Damascus's willingness to use state-owned ships to transport the illegally obtained grains has increased its appeal to Moscow and made the smuggling operation significantly easier. The Syrian ships that are known to have been involved in this illicit trade have been sanctioned since 2015 by the US for their role in supporting the Syrian regime during the conflict. But instead of reducing their illicit activities, the designation has apparently increased their cooperation with other sanctioned entities in Russia. In other words, the fear of additional sanctions does not seem to be a major concern, especially in comparison to the lucrative gains of such cooperation. Russia has also leveraged its loans to Syria to sell the stolen wheat to the regime at a rate much higher than the market price. Due to Syria's lack of revenues and foreign currency, the government does not seem to have much choice but to accept Russia's demands. According to my research, the Syrian government instructed its officials to award its wheat tenders to Russian companies, regardless of how uncompetitive their offers were. As a result, Syria imported 1.5 million tons of Russian wheat in 2021 for around $319 per ton, while the global price was around $235 per ton. Now, despite the substantial quantity of imported wheat, the Syrian government is still struggling with dire shortages due to corruption and nepotism. The state-sponsored corruption occurs at different phases of the conflict supply chain, including license, procurement, transportation, and distribution. For example, my research highlights that traders in Syria have to pay bribes estimated at 20 to 30% of the shipment's value to transport wheat inside the country. The increased wheat costs for the government has pushed it to take several austerity measures to reduce subsidized flour and bread. In addition to increasing prices, The government has limited the amount of subsidized bread families can buy, pushing many to purchase non-subsidized bread at significantly higher prices. The resulting lack of access to this essential commodity has forced millions of Syrians to go hungry. According to the UN, 90% of Syrians live below the poverty line, and more than 80% are food insecure. As a result, families are eating less, cutting meals, and going into debt in order to meet their basic needs. Thank you for listening and for your patience. Iris, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hyde. And so let me pass on to Iris, who's going to kickstart our discussion, responding to what we've heard from both Dr. Steve and Dr. Hyde, and really looking at this maybe from a policy perspective. What is it that has really struck you, Iris, and are there particular questions that you want to put back to our two speakers? So over to you, Iris.
Thank you very much, Margie, and thanks for those two presentations. I'll start with the last one because I only have one question, and that is, what is your recommendation? We knew all of that for a while ago, especially the governments that have the intel and compare the satellite pictures and whatnot, the data we have. And we know that sanctions are not really getting at what you just described. So what do you suggest? My sense would always be to ask cui bono, who benefits, and then that's almost a task for investigative journalism to get to the bottom of. But maybe the answer is for Hadid. I have a couple more questions on the Horn of Africa issue, where I spent 10 years, and some of it, I also looked quickly at the participants list, Margie, so I can literally see some names who are twitching to come in. So I'll leave some of this to them to ask. But there are a few things that I found really, really surprising, that there has been a historical shift from less vulnerability to more vulnerability in the food system as a result of imports. And I thought, wow, that's a new one. No mention of climate change, no mention of population growth, no mention of lack of coherence or vested interest, political economy analysis, conflicting incentive schemes that involve everybody from traditional leaders all the way to foreign direct investors and governments that strike an elite deal to elite deal over time. So it would be interesting to see something about the timeline. Then there was something where I would bluntly say this is wrong. There was a statement, war in Ukraine caused a food security crisis in the Horn of Africa, where we wish. There was a massive, almost unprecedented number of people dependent on support because they were in crisis, emergency, or famine levels before the war broke out. The war made it a lot worse, but it certainly didn't cause it. Then there's also interesting question about historically, the Horn of Africa relied on its own food production, and now they're dependent on imports. So the question would be, how many people were food secure at the time? What were the nutrition levels over the timeline? And how many depend on imports for food security and nutritional dietary diversity now? So that's another question. I first came to the Horn of Africa in the 2000s. And I would claim that we know precious little about famines over the timeline, which is significant that you explained, because as late as the 2000s, there were people dying in the droughts post El Nino 1997 that never made it onto any statistical list. Lots of them, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands. So that was just 20 years ago. So how reliable are the data that we're looking at? And then what I really think would be useful to know more about is a robust political economy analysis. And that also includes the statements, development programs fail to reverse decades of dependence on food imports. My question would be, is the objective of development programs coherent? Are we perhaps being a little bit naive, assuming they all want to strive towards food sovereignty or food self-sufficiency, if that's an option? Representing the UK government, I would say we are for free and fair rules-based global trade. So maybe that is a little bit simplistic. And then as a policymaker speaking to our ministers, the question is for both. What do we learn from this analysis? What are the recommendations and what should be done differently? And overall, what would you tell decision makers they could do better, because we can't turn back the time even if we wanted to? And plus, maybe that's more of an appeal, Margie, to the participants. I'd really love to hear from somebody from the Horn of Africa on this one. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Iris, for some good provoking questions to start our discussion. I'm just going to say, West, before we go back to the speakers, I'm just going to say to everybody, if you look at the panel at the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A function or a Q&A icon, and this is open. So please do start posting your questions. We will be taking questions in this sort of chat way because there's so many people online. So please start posting your questions. And whilst you do that, let's go back to the two speakers, and maybe we'll start with Dr. Hyde. And I think particularly this question that Iris has posed of, so what's the message for policymakers? What's the policy recommendation? So Hyde, over to you first.
Well, thank you. It's not an easy question to answer for sure. I think if we just look at the actions that have been taken so far, you'd see that only a number of Russian individuals and officials have been sanctioned due to their direct involvement in the smuggling of wheat from Ukraine, not only to Syria but to other countries. And that has been, as I said, partially successful due to the fear of secondary sanctions. But the problem is that it's not really doing much in order to prevent those entities that are already sanctioned, in order to make their cooperation costly and, in a sense, more difficult. Now, if you go to Syria, you see that in Syria, the government there is relying on state-owned ships. In Russia, they do the same. So the fear of hiring a third sort of private ships is not really doing much in order to prevent or limit their cooperation. So what we need to do, the policymakers need to do, is to be able to first identify the different actors involved, and then think of ways in order to make that cooperation more costly and more difficult. There could be different options for that. We cannot get into that right now, but I think this is the missing point. The second point is, I think, related to, I only mentioned Syria and Russia here, but there are other governments and other entities that are benefiting from that. I think knowing and identifying those entities and actors and going after them, or at least making their participation, reveal and exposing their participation, might be another step in that direction. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Hyde, I might just stay with you for 1 minute and then we'll move to the Horn of Africa. We've got a question that's come up in the chat asking why the Syrian regime has allowed its ships to be used to transport stolen wheat from Ukraine, and aren't they sanctioned and prohibited from navigation? So perhaps if you wouldn't mind taking that one, and then we'll move to the Red Sea region of Africa.
Sure. So the 3 ships that are involved in the shipment, as mentioned, they are sanctioned, but the sanctions alone don't really prevent them from leaving or from sailing in general. What the sanctions have, the main impact so far is that the sanctions has made ensuring those ships more difficult and has prevented some actors and businesses from dealing with them. But now when it comes to why they are doing what they are doing, that's mainly because private ships are hesitant to do so due to fear of secondary sanctions, and because the government in Syria is directly benefiting from those shipments. They are shipping them to Syria in order to distribute them there. The third one is that because that's one of the reasons that attracts or increases Syria's appeal to Russia as a market, because Syria does not really have much money. So if they cannot help them with smuggling and shipping and transporting the wheat, then they don't really bring much to the table. I hope that clarifies the point I'm trying to make. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aid. Stephen, can we come to you now? So there was a number of questions that Iris put to you, and we've also got a couple in the Q&A chat about how much market failure has been an issue in the Horn of Africa following Amartya Sen's work, and also how much rent seeking, what impact that has had on the decline of rural economies, specifically in Sudan. So over to you, Stephen, and feel free to pick up any of Iris's questions, and maybe particularly the policy implication question.
Sure, I am very happy for this set of questions also, because I think it points to the value of the article that I wrote, and maybe of today's conversation, which is, I'm a historian. I've been working on the topic of the history of famine and its relationship to poverty in the Horn of Africa for over 15 years, studying specifically why and when over the past few hundred years, food vulnerability to food crises peaked and waned. And I think that the research shows things that are maybe sometimes counterintuitive to people that are in public policy. I think one of the central findings, I think, is that it is not true that the past is just a time of food scarcity, where what we can and should expect is that everyone is repeatedly suffering from famine, especially famines at the slightest kinds of ecological shocks, such as normal conditions, like a drought every few years is a normal environmental condition, and expecting a drought every few years to produce a food crisis in which people are likely to die, or there might be increased mortality, that should be surprising to us. And that was not always true. There was a complex set of systems that prevented that from happening in the past, that broke down to the present. I mean, that was something that I couldn't get to talk to in the talk, because what I'm asked to is to show that what I was asked to is to show when this kind of dependence on imports began, and what the response has been, and how that has led up to what's going on now, and why, we're in a condition 100 years after people noticed that being dependent on food imports in this region is new and also troubling, in which a lot, possibly nearly the majority of foreign investment in the region has been geared towards, in some way or another, relating to food security, expanding food security. This is not like an accident, and it was not just a thing I think, incoherence, because if anything, until the 1970s, it was the most coherent. It was the basis. It was basically everything, and even things that you would not think were, like the Gezira scheme in Sudan was actually first started as a scheme to make Sudan be a food exporting country, not a food importing country, and eventually became a cotton program. And those things are things that have failed. I mean, it is like a history of failure, and that history of failure is important. And I think that what is very important for maybe public policy people to understand is that the suggestions that come recent to address problems that appear to be recent when seen in a historical perspective, like, okay, we've seen these before. Actually, this problem isn't recent. It's true, the war in Ukraine, I didn't mean to imply. I mean, I'm looking at this in a kind of different perspective. The war in Ukraine is not the start of a problem. The start of the problem, as I tried to outline, was 100 years ago. Over 100 years ago, what it was is an uptick in a problem. So same too in 2018, 2008, we can keep going, 1984, we can keep going back. And I think that's something that's like important to, I think that's important and has important public policy implications, also public policy implications for where investment should possibly go to and what should happen. So if your public policy is based on, okay, recent innovations seem bad, maybe we can move things back a little bit. Let's say we try to get people to the same level of, you know, I don't know, dependence on agriculture, depends on the agricultural sector as we had in the 1970s. You know, that was a moment of crisis also. And what I'm trying to point to and what my work tries to point to is like, maybe we cannot look to the recent 100 years to say that any of those times were not moments of crisis, of food crisis, and maybe we should look at things before then. So what was before then, and to get to maybe some potential solution is like, okay, it was a system of production that, as I mentioned, one of the major features is dependent on oxen, but actually one of the other major features is that it was embedded in a robust social safety net. The food, primarily grain, was not marketed. It was transferred through social relations, through long-standing contract relations, through relations between farmers and the elites that live amongst them. And within that was a system in which it was expected that in years of plenty, you pay taxes. In years of leanness, you get help. Like that was a fundamental basic point. The need for help is not an.
Stephen, you've just gone on to mute.
Sorry, I don't know what happened there. The need for social safety net is not an aberration of modernity. It is a structure of society that helps to that helps survival, and that has helped survival, and that, you know, yeah, maybe it is true that in the past, before the 20th and before the end of the 19th century, productivity was lower. But then when we have moments where this social safety net was working properly, which it did not always work in the hundreds of years before them, when we have periods where it does, you find that actually normal environmental variability did not produce famine. It produced nothing. It produced people going about their business, and then the next year they go about their business again. You find a disconnection between normal environmental variability and food scarcity. Food scarcity, and I think that's something to think about. And I think maybe that also potentially answers the questions from the Q&A.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen. And we've got a lot of people online, so I just want to really encourage people, please do use the Q&A function to post your questions. As Iris said, we know we've got a lot of people online who are also experts in this topic, so please don't be shy to put up your questions. We've got another very specific one on Syria, Haid, on about Syrian businessmen from the diaspora and the extent to which they're involved with this criminal trade.
Well, thank you. The short answer is that we really don't know, because so far what we know is that most of the people who have been reported to have been involved in the trade are somehow either officials who created offshore companies in order to benefit from the trade, or businessmen who are based in Damascus and who are affiliated with the regime. Now, that does not mean that they are not. There's no other businessmen, whether Syrians or from other nationalities, who are involved. But what we know is that we need more work in order to be able to identify the different actors involved, and that's the point I was trying to make. To just clarify what I mean here, one of the Syrian ships last summer was temporarily seized in Lebanon because the Ukrainian embassy there reported the wheat shipment on that ship to be stolen. and the ship was coming from Ukraine, or supposedly coming from the Black Sea. They're saying that they were coming from Russia, but the allegation is that they brought the wheat from Ukraine and they're selling it in Lebanon, or at least selling part of it in Lebanon before moving to Syria. Now, when the Lebanese government asked the Ukrainian embassy to provide evidence and prove that the wheat is stolen, they were not able to do so because they did not have enough evidence. And I think that's where other countries who have more sophisticated systems to basically identify and prove those shipments could have helped in order to prevent that from happening. And due to the lack of evidence, what happened is that the Lebanese government allowed the ship to leave, and then the ship took the shipment and went to Syria and provided that. So that could have been prevented if other countries would have shared any information if they have it, and if they don't have it, then this is one of the areas that we need to focus on. Make sure that we document those shipments and try to find ways to stop them whenever possible in order to prevent the people benefiting from this illicit trade from continuing to benefit. Over.
Great, thank you, Haid. And we've got a question from one of the researchers in South Sudan who's asking about another potential cost of becoming dependent on imported food, which is when the food that's imported is substandard, but is coming into the country to meet high demand, and that's an issue in South Sudan. Stephen, maybe I should put that one to you, but also if you want to pick up on the other question that we've got about food and cattle trading routes being used by criminal groups and actors. I think that's a question that would straddle both geographic regions that we're looking at. So if you want to have a go at answering the second question as well, but maybe start off with the health implications of substandard food imports.
Sure. I mean, I think that this points to a vulnerability that was just outside of the scope of what it was that I was talking about today. But I think that that's a general vulnerability. I think Haid's talk also points to more, right? Today I chose to talk about specifically just access to quantity at a price that is affordable, just purely on access, and not really about what the nature of that quality or the ability to select or choose or determine. I think this idea that there is the reality that there is substandard food that can and does often enter into these countries is really one that shows to the extent to which what we're talking about also is poverty, right? We are talking about what happens when both on a macro scale, an economy, but also on a micro scale, the individual people living within that economy don't really have the economic power in order to command secure access to nutritious food in sufficient quantities. And that the ways in which that could be insecure is multivariable, and I think every one of them should be of concern. The way out of that, right, is to recognize that this is not disentangled from poverty. These are the same kind of questions, right? If you are rich enough to be able to command, let's say it's just to command the market, then you will be able to have choice. When you aren't, then you don't have choice, and with that comes, I think, other kinds of vulnerability. I think one thing that Haid's talk points to, and maybe the kind of overall question of this link points to, is that the historic past that I very loosely pointed to is not completely gone from the region in which I study. Part of the way that the social safety net that I described functioned, right, is I as as a producer, give in times of plenty so that I can receive in times of scarcity, that dynamic does not completely disappear. It re-emerges in other ways. Often, at times, these are ways that can be destabilizing when the people in power are not willing to participate in this, when they are unwilling to, when the people that command the state are unwilling to give in times of scarcity. Even when that scarcity is not super extreme, but still felt, then people will use this this kind of traditional, these traditional patterns of relationships and find other ones. We see this historically in the past, where you have moments in which suddenly an upstart comes along and is like, okay, I have some money and I can invest this in food, and I can use that investment in food in this moment of scarcity to give to people who are in need. And suddenly this upstart has a lot of followers, and what they do with that followers is up to them. And sometimes that could be things that are particularly nefarious. Sometimes those can be things that seem to be beneficial. Either way, that relationship, what does that relationship look like to an outsider? Also, I think we need to ask ourselves seriously about that, right? Like, is this a kind of corruption, or is this how a system is properly functioning? I think I just want to leave it at that.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. And I kind of wanted to maybe put it to any and all of you. And Iris, I would welcome giving you the chance to come back in on this. I think that the last question that we've got around, trading being used by criminal groups. And I think, Haid, you've demonstrated very clearly the links to the war economy. And I guess the question that I certainly would want to maybe put across to all of you is, are there general policies or lessons that we can learn, or is it so context specific that you have to really, really understand the context, which I think Haid is sort of where your answer was driving at to the last question, is like really understanding the context and therefore really having very tailored policies. So Haid, I don't know whether you want to say more to that, and then maybe I'll come to you, Iris, if you'd like to, as somebody who's sitting in a policy position, your thoughts on that. So let me go to you, Haid, first.
Sure, thank you. I think just before I actually answer the question, I did not talk about it right now, but I want to flag that the ships that are being used to transport wheat from Ukraine, some of them are also used in order to transport weapons and other military equipments to Ukraine. So it's not only used for food items. The same thing applies to other files I worked on in Syria, for example, where the same routes from Syria to Iraq or from Syria to Lebanon are used for illicit and licit, to smuggle licit and illicit commodities. For example, you would see that bread is being smuggled from one country to another, but also the same routes are used to smuggle drugs in and out of that country. Now, to answer the question directly, I think in general, there are lessons learned that could apply to different conflicts, but I would always be cautious to generalize the policy recommendations. To clarify that, for example, when it comes to sanctions, and the issue I was trying to make, the point I was trying to make is that sanctions could work to a certain extent, but will not prevent those who are already sanctioned from dealing with one another. That conclusion applies to many other contexts. It's not only limited to Syria and Russia, but moving beyond that, when you need to talk about, okay, what can we do in order to prevent that? That's, I think, when you need to tailor, to understand the context and tailor your response accordingly. You cannot just say, we'll do this, we'll do that. You'll have to understand the context, understand the dynamics, understand and identify the actors, and then see what's the best way to basically prevent them from doing what they're doing or make that what they're doing more difficult. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Haid. Iris, wondered if you'd like to chip into this conversation.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe on both. You already mentioned the rules of the war economy regarding Syria and stolen grain from Ukraine, so that explains a lot. And I think the thing that we often fail as policymakers to look at and take a very, very sober look at, that's why I mentioned investigative journalism, it's to look at the whole supply chain and its operators and who is linked to whom. We know that global food trade is a global web of shell companies and whatnot, and all of that escalates when you have a geopolitically charged situation like you have now in the world. And for example, what you said about Lebanon, etc., everybody knew that, but who could have made the decision, and what's the trade-off there, and who would have to lean on whom in what country for this to be sanctioned? That is something that really needs to be laid open, and then the pressure needs to be applied. And that's where our role is long over. I mean, we try to put as much evidence on the table as possible on these things, but as policymakers, even in a, you know that thing, in a war, the first casualty is the truth and the evidence-based policymaking. So that's one. The other one is more about Horn of Africa. To be very honest, I'm still not very happy. All those questions that Stephen is asking, we asked over years and years and years. And it starts with what is food security? It's clearly defined. Its various phases in food insecurity are clearly defined. So we need to be a bit specific on that, and also say who's food security. If there was a program in Sudan that looked at food security and then did all exports, yeah, well, it didn't define whose food security it was. Maybe it was a country where the exports went that was more food secure. So that's not necessarily, and unless we get very substantive and granular in the debate, it may not be that meaningful. And on the weather and climate variability in the region, boy, did we do lots of field visits and interviews and talk to analysts, weather patterns analysts. And what we found, honestly, is actually the plantation operators of the British Empire had the best timelines. And they were absolutely stunning, much, much more than government agencies and others. So there was a clear pattern that after the big El Nino in 1997, nothing has ever gone right again. So erratic weather patterns were very, very much bigger in both directions, cycles narrower, impacts higher. And yeah, if you talk to people, that's another one. There is also something that I found very interesting, because you didn't mention it. As a historian, I thought one of the first things you would mention is the slave trade. A big coping mechanism in the past was that farmers, when bad times were bad, they would just give a couple of their children and family, especially those not wanted, to the Omani slave traders. Lots of kamba, lots of lures ended up in other parts of the world over that. And that's something, maybe that's not politically correct to say it, but as a historian, I think I would put all of those factors on the table. I'm not saying with lower populations and less pressures and more linkages to world markets, things are getting easier. But it sounded a little bit like in the glory past, the peasants were all happy and healthy and food secure. I think that would be worth another look. I'll leave it at that because I'm getting a stern look from Margie and I'm being too long. Thanks.
Not at all, Iris. There was no stern look intended at all. I just want to say this would be the last chance if anybody in the online audience would like to post a question. This would be, as we're getting towards the end of the session, this is the final chance to put any questions to the panelists. And worth waiting to see if there's any final question. Let me just go back to, well, Stephen, let me give you the word, and then Haid, a last word before I wrap up.
Sure, thank you. I think my final word is just that I think that a robust engagement with history is absolutely necessary. I think that has clearly been showcased in the discussion that we're currently having. I think, Iris, in your response to what it is that you're saying, to what it is that I was saying, I think that what often passes for history is very thin. And I think that what we need is something that is really more profoundly deep. I would suggest to some people, maybe reading my own work might be helpful, because I think that there is a lot of value in looking at the past over a long duration, and not just simply since the 1970s or the 1990s or 1997 or more recently, because we can find things that are perhaps surprising. And yeah, in a talk like this, the specifics can be elided slightly in order to save space, I think. But this is also not a talk is not the space for that kind of deep analysis, which I think is maybe the thing that is often lacking in a lot of the kind of programmings that we're trying to influence.
Thank you, Stephen. Haid, final word from you.
Sure. I just want to clarify that my whole basically discussion and main policy recommendation focus on sanctions. And sanctions are not usually my first option, but unfortunately, sometimes they're the only option, especially in this case. But even though knowing the benefits and the necessity of sanctions at times, we should be aware of the consequences of those sanctions. So whenever sanctions are imposed, I think we should make sure that those sanctions are not making the wrong people suffer. And this will be also important to highlight, because there are many issues and many misinformation regarding the impact of sanctions. Some of them are for sure true, even if they are not intentional, but others are exaggerated. So also, I think being able to share and be clear about the objectives and impact of those sanctions will be important in this era of misinformation that could be weaponized against different actors. Thank you.
Thank you, Haid. That's a really useful, I think, clarification. Great. So that pretty much brings us to the end. I just want to really thank the speakers. I think, we've been looking at two different contexts, different geographical contexts, over two different time frames. In African Red Sea region, we're been looking at a period of about 100 years, with Syria much shorter. But I think the kind of what you both demonstrated is the kind of destabilizing consequences of some of the trends, that whether it's for a short time period or not. But I think particularly for me, what I'm really taking away from this is it's the importance of understanding the political economy of the food trade, and doing that with a historical perspective as much as possible, and being aware of the costs, both at the kind of macro level in terms of crippling the overall economy, but also especially at the micro level in terms of the consequences for the poorest, which it's really important that we don't lose sight of as we talk about some of these bigger dynamics. They're the ones who are ultimately and often very tragically bearing the costs. And Iris, thank you for helping us think through the policy implications of this, and for your great challenges. It's what makes these conversations really interesting. So thank you for the challenges. I just want to say before we finish, for some of you online, you may be interested to know about the Rift Valley Institute's forthcoming open course on the Horn of Africa, which is going to be held at the end of July in Kenya, directed by Ken Monkhouse and Michael Waldemariam. And it does have some relevance to what we've been talking about today. The particular focus this year is on enduring resilience. And we know in the Horn of Africa that the resilience of households, communities, and indeed states has been tested to a very extreme extent in the last few years. So that the course will be looking at that, in relation to some things we've been talking about today. It'll be bringing together top regional experts to help course participants examine those sources of crises. So just wanted to let you know about that course, which may be of interest to some of you. Otherwise, let me say again, huge thanks to all of you coming online and to those of you who posted questions, to all of our speakers and to the XCEPT program for hosting and making the webinar possible. Thank you very much indeed.